Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. I do hope you're doing fabulously well. I'm doing great, thank you very much, and I hope you're going to get that quintessential perfect drink, whether it's a hot cup of cocoa or an ice-cold glass of Coca-Cola, or whatever it is that you enjoy drinking, go and get it, because I've got the most fabulous story for you tonight. And let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Hugh, and I'm from Western Canada, which is a prepossessing area around British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, and it's part of the world known for its exquisite Rocky Mountains and its famous ski resorts, and of course turquoise lakes, namely Lake Louise, which bedazzles and beguiles hundreds of tourists that visit our part of the world every single year. I was raised in Alberta, which in my unbiased opinion is the most beautiful province in Canada, which is home to the Moraine Lake and Banff National Park. I grew up in the early 80s in a double-storey home surrounded by exquisite mountainous views, undulating verdant countryside, flowery prairies, and exquisite silvery lakes. My immediate family consisted of my older brother Warren and both my beloved parents. Growing up, my parents were very private, contained people who did not rarely converse with outsiders, so our immediate circle of friends was very small and condensed. However, as a young boy, my brother and I made copious amounts of good friends through school and Boy Scouts, but my parents always encouraged us to spend time at their homes rather than inviting them back to our place, which was on my part a real bummer. I think the problem arose from my mother's deep-seated insecurities and self-consciousness. She was a very elegant, stylish and petite woman with shoulder-length dark auburn hair, pale skin and blue eyes, and she was incredibly attractive, so much so that half the boys in my school had a huge crush on her. "Is that your mother?" they would say when she came to pick us up from school, and they would eye her with wide eyes and say, "She's ever so pretty." I do not know why my mother was so sequestered, self-effacing and eremitical, and I can assure you, all these years later, I still know only scant, vague, rather indeterminate nebulous details about my mother's childhood, which is still deeply cloaked and clouded in a mystery that I would rather not unearth, for fear of what I might uncover. So I'd rather let sleeping dogs lie. I never met my grandparents on her side, so I'm rather inclined to believe that she must have encountered some trauma growing up that caused her to become such a reclusive, withdrawn introvert, who hated any form of social interaction, and sometimes appeared unintentionally rude and standoffish to strangers due to her desperate need to escape any kind of social interaction. I do recall that social events like sports days, school plays and parents' evenings at our school were only ever attended by my father, as my mother chose to remain isolated and solitary, sheltering herself from attending any event that would potentially overwhelm and oppress her. She was like a tortoise who would shrink back in her shell when she felt very unsafe. I assure you she did have a full and happy life and adored us as her children, but she was never comfortable around crowds of people. The only thing I do know about my mother is that she did run away from home hundreds of times as a young girl, and that she had a father who was always getting drunk and was a very volatile, explosive and belligerent man, so I think it would be safe to assume that her childhood was not a happy one and that she did suffer a measure of abuse. I do recall on numerous occasions my friends would say that their parents thought my mother was a snob who looked down at everybody and seemed to have the superiority complex, but nothing could be further from the truth. My mother did have one very close friend, a lady called Cynthia, who was like a sister that she never had, and Cynthia and her were as thick as thieves, and I believe she knew more about my mother than anybody else in the world did, and that includes my father. I do remember Cynthia telling me once, "Your mother is so misunderstood by everyone. She's like such a gentle doe with the biggest, most beautiful heart that is so fragile, sometimes frightened and timid, but so glorious and precious." And I knew she was right, because my mother was indeed a magnificent soul, and just because she did not conform to natural stereotypes of what many would consider to be normal, did not make her of any less value. My story that ultimately led to my incredulous, rather extraordinary Bigfoot encounter happened when I was about 12 years old, and we lived in the mountains, so we often asked our parents if we could camp out of doors, and they were always consenting and agreeable to these arrangements. My father would give me his rifle for protection, as we lived in bear country, and there were other predators that loitered around, such as mountain lions, coyotes, wolves and bobcats, so we needed to be ever wary of these creatures, but in most cases these animals were probably more apprehensive about us than we were about them. "I like it very much indeed when you get close to nature," my father would say. "Nothing is richer or better for the soul than to breathe in the fresh mountain air and to fend for yourself in the wild, embracing all manner of weather conditions and all kinds of exciting challenges that will set you well up for your manhood." From when we were 10 years old, we had learned how to hunt and fish, which were savvy, proficient skills we procured, thanks to my father, who was a very competent hunter himself. As boys, many a summer night was spent camping under the stars and making a fire pit for ourselves where we cooked the fish we had caught in the lake over an open grill, and nothing was more delicious than the flaky taste of that buttery fish that melted in our mouths. My brother and I always fancied ourselves as intrepid adventurers, and we simply adored exploring the woodgreen, as it was an enchanting, magical and whimsical world within a world, and almost a meditational hangout or sanctuary, if you like, where we could ponder over our thoughts, and it brought us so much peace. My father always used to say that trees are like nature's natural healers because their energy balances and grounds us, and I am absolutely certain he's right. This woodgreen was utterly magnificent, and the word breathtaking comes to mind when I begin to describe it to you. It was an idyllic haven for indigenous wildlife, from elk to mule deer, squirrels, chipmunks, raccoons, wolves, foxes, and the list goes on. Yet there was something oddly peculiar and enigmatic about these stumps that my brother and I could never ever fathom. They appeared to be covered in very intentional decorative displays, where lean, thin timber sticks were aligned over each other with meticulous precision, almost as if someone were paying them homage and honouring them, much like we remember our dead with a headstone in a graveyard. My brother and I noticed these strange displays throughout our lifetimes in the woodgreen, along with branches where bark had been purposely removed off every few trees, which seemed to mark a trail of some sort. But who or what was actually doing this, we could never understand. All these years later, I am convinced that these are the works of a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch, or even a Yeti if you like. We used to hitch our tents on the granular beach that overlooked the mesmerising silvery lake that was fringed by the masterful statuesque backdrops of the mountains, which were scantily scattered with a few clusters of spruce, logpole pines and red maples on the lowest elevation. The rear of our tents was of course heavily flanked by the woodgreen that we explored so much. One pleasant day in the late summer of 1983, after my brother and I had pitched our tent for the night and prepared our fire pit, while spending a relaxing and rewarding afternoon fishing by the lake, we successfully caught several medium-sized trout, which we grilled over the fire pit and ate hungrily, and they were very delicious. We then sat back on our camp chairs and gazed up at the kaleidoscope of the silvery stars and the full ivory moon that enveloped the dusky sky in an ethereal luminescence. The dusky shadows danced under the moon, accentuating the resplendence of the lake and its gentle waves of water that rippled delicately, whilst it reflected the mountains, trees, and even the stars on its shimmering surface. We could hear the sounds of chirping crickets and croaking frogs, interspersed with the distant howls of a wolf or a coyote. "Oh boy, it's such a beautiful night tonight," I said to my brother. "I'm so glad we live here in Alberta. I don't think I'd want to live anywhere else in the world." "I know exactly what you mean," said my brother. "I also couldn't imagine living anywhere else." Before we dived into our sleeping bags to turn in for the night, I decided to quickly go and relieve myself and venture into the woodgreen that was behind our tent. I walked on the leaf litter and crunched the debris beneath my feet, and I was pretty certain I'd heard a rustle in the leaves behind me, and I grinned to myself. I knew it was my brother creeping up behind me with great stealth in order to play a trick on me, and in the process scare me half to death. It was so typical of him to do this. I was now on to his little game, and had him cornered, and I was rather pleased with myself, feeling ever so smug, and I was about to turn his little trick back in on him and give him the scare he was unlikely to ever forget. I could hear him rustling around and discern a branch moving, and so I pounced on him unexpectedly to surprise him, but it was not my brother, it was a bear. I am sure the creature mistook my antics as an act of aggression on my part, and looked very aggrieved to see me. My heart was pounding violently in my chest, and I tried to remember everything I'd learnt about bears. What was it? Play dead with a grizzly? Fight for your life with a black bear? In truth, when confronting a bear in the wild, sometimes everything you ever thought you learnt, and all those words of wisdom, just go flying out of the window, as you tend to follow your gut instincts instead, and fight for your life, which is exactly what I did. I could not tell what this bear was, because it was so dark, but it was huge and powerful, and its dark, shadowy silhouette was very intimidating. It bolted towards me unhesitantly, resisting any attempt to mock charge me, raising itself up on its hind legs. It began to beat me violently with its sizable, large paws, and it bit me viciously with its teeth all over my body. I did not feel any pain, but I fought back by kicking the bear and oscillating my arms wildly and trying to punch him as I was driven by a powerful adrenaline surge which increased my strength and stamina. It would seem that my fear and anxiety had been placed on the back burner, as my primary focus was to stay alive and to fight with all my strength, might, and every last bit of energy left within me. But I was no match for this sizable creature. I felt like a tiny mouse in the presence of a domestic tabby, and you know it's on rare occasions that the mouse manages to outrun the cat. I knew things were looking bleak for me, and I was certain I was dead, but I kept fighting back, feeling water pouring down my head, blinding my eyes and trickling into my mouth, and I could taste the metallic, salty taste of my own blood. The last thing I remember was being lashed across the head so violently that everything became foggy and hazy, and I must have passed out, because I don't remember anything after that. Looking back, I think that my state of unconsciousness had literally convinced the bear that I was finally dead, and was, in fact, my saving grace. I remember waking up feeling completely disorientated, confused, and befuddled. Where was I wondered? I realised suddenly that I was buried in the depths of the ground, in what can only be described as a large open pit, beneath layers of branches that were crossed over me, and I realised I was in some kind of a nest, and quickly discerned and smelt the disgusting and rotting carcass of a deer being eaten alive by maggots, lying yards away from me, and I could hear those maggots eating the flesh. I could smell pine and see a few bones scattered liberally among the acorns, and low brush leaves from blueberry and raspberry bushes. I remember my head was throbbing violently. There wasn't a part of my body that was not aching or on fire. I kept slipping in and out of consciousness, and there were times when I could hear what I thought were the frantic screams and calls of my mother and father calling out my name. "Hugh! Hugh! Where are you? Hugh! Hugh! Hugh!" The voices kept calling. They were obviously searching for me, but I didn't answer, for my lips could barely move. They were dry, parched, and crusty, and my throat was full of clotted blood, while my fatigued body was exceedingly weak, and I felt as if I was fading away. I didn't care any more. I felt almost as if I'd been pulverized in a mincer, and the shooting pain that seared through my body was so incredibly dreadful that quite frankly I was happy to surrender to my impending death with an ease and acceptance of note. I just wished with all my heart that I would slip away easily and effortlessly, because I didn't have any strength or fight left in me. How long I was buried in this nest I cannot tell you, and whether this renowned omnivore was intending to eat me or not, I didn't even know. On one poignant occasion I thought that the bear had returned, after he had believed I had been marinated in my own body fluids and had been transformed into a succulent, tender and juicy steak for him. I could hear his hefty, sizable form rummaging through the nest, as if searching for me. I could discern that the dead deer being eaten alive by maggots had been thrown out of the nest and promptly disregarded, while some of the maggots had been flung over me and were now crawling and wiggling all over my skin and sucking on my dried blood hungrily. I could hear and feel pine branches being lifted off my body and flung out of the nest. I was too numb to be afraid, for all emotions and energy were so drained and depleted from me, like the water from a sink, and I was willingly resigned to my imminent plight. I could sense the odious bear examining my body with its head only inches away from my face, and I surreptitiously opened my eyes, one after the other, and found myself looking into the concerned, deep-set dark eyes of an exceedingly human face that I realized later possessed a body shape and form equally as big as a bear, but covered with long flowing human-like hair. This creature looked astonished and confounded to see me, as the expression in his eyes was dumbfounded, almost as if he couldn't believe what he was perceiving. The creature used his sausage-sized fingers to wipe away the dirt and blood from my face to get a better view of me. I remember he was smelling me intently, while his expression remained bewildered, and his grunts sounded rather like he was saying, "What the heck is this?" I could feel him rest a very small part of his pyramid-shaped head, which must have been his ear, on my chest, as if he was trying to establish whether I had a heartbeat at all. I think he realized I was alive, because the very next thing I knew was that he lifted me up very gently in his overlong arms like a fragile china doll that he was absolutely terrified of breaking, and he ran with me like the wind in his arms, with such a gentle grace, never bumping my body once, as I assure you any sudden jolts would quite literally have detonated the landmines of my nervous system to explode into sparks of shooting pain throughout my body. I do not think I've ever been carried so gently in my entire life, and I never will be again. And this creature glided through the wood-green, past the silvery lake, through the flowery meadow, towards my parents' home, and then on reaching our home he let out several high-pitched whistles. My mother, on hearing the strange whistle, glanced out of the upstairs window, only to see a huge shadowy form standing beneath the window, staring up at her with a red eye-shine, and carrying in his arms a bundle that she discerned had to be me. She told me later that she sensed my energy, and she felt no fear towards the outlandish creature, hurriedly raced down the stairs and came running out towards me, and I could hear her frantic sobs. The creature looked directly at my mother, with very sorrowful eyes, for I am sure he thought I was dying, and he placed me gently on the ground, and then glided away into the woods, and that was the last thing that I remember. I woke up to find myself in a private hospital room, after having received an extensive operation for a shattered femur, while my body was badly bruised, and I had bites around my neck and upper chest, and my head wounds had caused me a great deal of bad concussion. I was informed by the doctor that I was exceedingly lucky to be alive, and had a narrow escape, and it was a miracle that I hadn't actually been killed, because I had taken a very serious thrashing. I was to learn from my brother that after I went to relieve myself that night, before we retired to our sleeping bags, my brother had promptly fallen asleep almost straight away, blissfully unaware of my absence. He had awoken the following morning to find me gone, and had quickly run home to tell my parents that I was missing. He felt exceedingly bad that I had succumbed to a bear attack, only yards away from where we were sleeping, while he remained blindly oblivious to the perilous danger that I had found myself in. "You know how private Mother is," said my brother. "She refused to tell anyone what happened to you. Not even the police were informed that you were missing. Mum and Dad did not stop searching for you day or night, and Mother was a complete mess. She thought you were dead. We had no idea what had happened to you. They did, of course, hire a tracker to try and find you, and he was unable to locate your body. He told us that you had clearly been attacked by a bear, as he found a very evident trail of bear prints close to where we camped, large bear scat, and one of your shoes lying on the ground, simply covered and drenched in your blood, along with ominous-looking drag marks. He said that he could see signs of a scuffle and droplets of your blood on random ferns, but not enough blood to affirm that you were dead. I think, of course, he did discover a bear nest, and he saw a deer carcass covered in maggots, but he did not see you in the nest, nor did he find the whereabouts of the bear that attacked you, as he intended to kill it." "Well, if he had actually moved the branches of the nest, he would have found me then," I piped. "I was under them." "Maybe not," said my brother. "You might have been invisible to him, even if he had looked at you directly. Do you have any idea how filthy you looked? You were as dirty as the ground, and your blood had turned a brown colour. Mother thinks it would have been almost impossible to see you, which was why she really regrets not hiring a tracker with a dog, because a dog would have smelt you, that's for sure. Do you realise that you were gone for 3 days and 2 nights? So long, I said. I had absolutely no idea. Of course you didn't, because half the time you were probably unconscious. But you have some maggots on you that cleaned up your wounds very nicely. The doctors were impressed by how clean your wounds were, because they could have gone septic, especially on the areas where you were bitten by the bear. Lovely, I said. That's what I really like to hear. How are you, sweetheart? Said my mother, gently pushing my brother out of the way and grabbing my hand and looking down at me on my hospital bed with doting, gentle, adoring eyes. I've been better, I said. Don't do that to me ever again. You hear me, son? You scared the living daylights out of me when I thought we'd lost you for good. You know what you boys are to me. You're both my world. I don't have many close to my heart, so you're my everything. I love the bones off the both of you. I know, Mum, I said. I'm so sorry. Don't you go apologising for anything, nor being sorry, said my mother sternly. None of this was your fault. I'm just so grateful to that creature for saving your life, because he rescued you from that bear nest. If it weren't for him, you would almost certainly have died. I must admit he was a kind-looking soul, but what he was, I couldn't fathom. I can only describe him as a huge angel sent by God himself, covered with hair, built like a giant, with the face of a human being, but a very, very kind face. And so it was after months of arduous, laborious rehabilitation and physiotherapy, once when I'd fully recovered and life had returned to normal again, my brother and I were up to our usual old tricks. And one day in the wood green, we were examining the strange arrangements of sticks on a stump of a large tree, where these anomalous designs were a source of great fascination and intrigue for us. Do you suppose they may be done by the creature that actually rescued me? I said. More than likely, said my brother. I mean, let's face it, whatever that creature was, he was definitely almost human. And it has to be something very intelligent that did this, because you can see that every single branch has been arranged intentionally and purposely in a very specific pattern. It's got to mean something. What do you think it means? I asked my brother. Well, maybe they value every tree, those creatures I mean, because they live in the forest, and the pattern is almost like a remembrance of the tree that once stood here, almost as if honouring it in some way. The creatures probably love trees, just like Dad does. All of a sudden I got the very distinct feeling that something was watching us. I think something's watching us, I whispered, feeling a chill running down my spine. I feel it too, said Warren, looking at me. Shh! I think I hear something. As you can imagine, I was particularly anxious, as after my bear attack, I was suffering from a degree of post-traumatic stress, and any strange sounds or feelings rattled my nerves. I looked around me very nervously, and then I could hear a crunching of twigs and leaves, and that was when I saw a dark silhouette peering at us from behind a tree curiously, and then it moved itself away from the tree and stood only yards away from me and began to whoop with delight. This huge creature that towered at 7 foot tall and was 700 pounds and 3 feet across the shoulders looked at me with an expression of astonishment upon his face, and he kept pointing at me with his overlong arms and continued to whoop with delight. It was as if he was saying, "It's a miracle! You're alive! I can't believe it! I thought you were a goner!" That was what his body language conveyed to me. This quirky, eccentric, rather comical-looking creature with bright, cheerful dark eyes that twinkled with humour was, I sensed, by nature as elusive and reticent as my mother is. But on this occasion he forgot his shyness for a moment, as it was seemingly suppressed and overshadowed by the joy he clearly felt to see me alive, for I could sense and feel his jubilance. He pointed at me and then to himself, and then to the direction of our home, and I realised at once that this was the creature who had rescued me, and he was explaining that he had saved my life. I began to point at him and smile, and I nodded my head. I said, "That's right, I remember you. You saved my life. Thank you so very much." I know this might sound very strange, But even my brother sensed that the creature knew exactly what I was saying and appreciated my words. He bounded up towards us, patted us enthusiastically on the back with his hand, let out a couple of happy whoops, and then glided away into the woods, whistling away happily. My brother and I grinned at each other. "What a lovely fellow," I said, and he agreed. "He's one of a kind, that's for sure," he said. It took 25 years for us to establish that the anomalous creature we encountered was known as Bigfoot, Sasquatch, or Yeti. Every year on the anniversary of my accident, my mother would leave out a box of goodies for him in the wood green. We would leave a huge selection of fruit, nuts, cookies, dried fruits, crisps, and jerky for the critter, and in return on our doorstep we would always find unusual shaped twigs, which I now believe were gifts. So there you are. That's my story. What an incredible story. And if you liked it, don't forget to subscribe. Until next time, goodbye and good night.